Today we return to the How We Began series. We are covering chapters 18 and 19 of Genesis, if anybody wants to follow along in the Bible. And in there we find the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, as a refresher, God had changed Abram's name to Abraham. Sarah and her maidservant Hagar had their little cat fight, and the covenant of circumcision was established. Lot had been saved from the warring kings. And remember that Lot took up residence in the area of Sodom. Now we find out why this was not a good choice as a place to establish residency. It will be helpful to remember to not look at this story through the eyes of our current context, because it won't make much sense. We need to consider the when, where, and why. Now, chapter 18 starts with Abraham receiving 3 guests. This seems simple enough, but of course there's extra stuff going on here. Verse 1 had Abraham near the great trees of Mamre. Mamre is where he lived, and the great trees are oaks. The wording sounds more impressive than it is. It's hot out, and Abraham is by his tent, most likely under a canopy to stay out of the sun. He sees 3 men. Now, do you find his response unusual? He hurried to meet them and bowed all the way to the ground, and then asks basically to have the honor of giving them food, drink, and rest. Abraham makes a big deal out of these visitors. Why? Well, we have to read into this to get it. Abraham uses the title Lord, even my Lord, in his greeting. He refers to himself as a servant. Now, if that's the way Abraham greets everybody, I'd love for a chance to go visit Abraham myself. But hospitality was a way of life back then. It was a big deal, and it showed a lot about a person's character. Today, hospitality is largely a lost value. But there is something more going on here. Abraham seemed to know right away that one of these 3 people was God. How would he know? Now, some theologians suggest that it was Jesus in human form. I don't know. I need some selling on that idea. But what we need to remember is that Abraham had 2 other visits from God before that, and several conversations. So it appears that he just recognized God because of the previous encounters. It didn't appear from the text that Abraham thought that God was coming to visit him specifically, because he offered to feed them before they continued on their journey. So the 3 stayed and ate, which would have been an extended amount of time because of all the food prep that had to happen first. While they were eating, God tells Abraham that Sarah will have a son when he visits next year. And Sarah hears this and laughs. Now, a lot of people frown at Sarah for that. But come on, Sarah was very old, way past menopause, and her physical body couldn't possibly produce a child, nor could she survive the process. Think about what had to happen to Sarah for her to be able to produce a child. She would have to become younger, in a sense anyway. Her body would have to regenerate to have the ability. At my attained age, I'd love to have my body regenerated. Wouldn't you? We need to remember that God is bigger than our circumstances. He enjoys doing the impossible, and I suspect he delights in confounding. Now we must wait until chapter 21 for the birth of Isaac, but God delivered on his promise. And please notice that there wasn't any ceremony. There was no hocus pocus, no string of special prayers and sacrifices, no incantations, no group of priests doing ritualistic, religious-looking stuff. God just said it would happen, and it did. The focus then quickly changes to Sodom and Gomorrah. The three leave for Sodom, and Abraham walks with them for a bit. This was another custom of the day. The host would walk with his visitors for a little while as they leave. The Lord speaks of an outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah. So God said to Abraham that he's going to look for himself. It is thought that the outcry mentioned was from the angels. Now please realize that the Almighty God did not need to walk to Sodom. This was for Abraham's sake. God lets Abraham know that he is most likely going to wipe out the two cities from the face of the earth. And this is when Abraham pleads with God to not wipe everyone out of there if there are righteous people there. Now Abraham starts this wheeling and dealing thing, getting God to promise not to wipe them out if there are as few as 10 righteous people. So let me ask a question. Why would Abraham care if Sodom and Gomorrah are wiped out or not? Any idea? Yes, thank you. Because Lot and his family are at Sodom. In chapter 9, the two angels are about to enter Sodom when Lot sees them. Notice where Lot is when he sees the angels. He was sitting in the gateway of the city. This is important. Now, most of you are probably picturing an archway of stone, maybe 12 inches thick, and Lot is sitting in a chair just by chance. That's not the situation. The gateway would be a massive structure that served as not only a guarded entryway into the walled city, but it is in the gateway that official city business took place. This indicates that Lot was a city official. There isn't any indication right away that Lot knew these visitors were angels, but I suspect he thought the two to be important people, so he invites them to his home and is insistent on it. And this is when things get downright messed up. Men from the city surround Lot's home and demand that he sends out the two visitors so that they can have sex with them. I know, it is so messed up. They weren't looking just for a homosexual encounter. They intended rape and most likely murder. Lot then pleads with them to not do it. He even offers up his daughters who are engaged to be married. Why would a father do that? Well, the culture suggests three possibilities. One is that men were more important than women at the time, so it would be considered a lesser offense. Another possible reason is that since they seemed to want the men, maybe they wouldn't bother the women if they went out. And the third possibility is that in that culture, hospitality included protecting guests. So Lot may have been trying to follow cultural norms. No matter what the reason, this is messed up. The men tried to storm the house when the angels in disguise pull Lot inside and make the men outside go blind. The angels let Lot know that he needs to leave right away because the cities are about to be destroyed. His daughter's fiancés don't believe what Lot says, so Lot leaves with just his wife and his 2 daughters. Now they are told to flee to the mountains, but Lot doesn't think he can get to the mountains in time, so pleads with them to let him get to the little town of Zoar. And they agreed and wiped out the cities on the plains. Now a problem arose after the angels told Lot's family not to look back. Lot's wife did. And she was turned into a pillar of salt. Weird, I know. She looked back. The lesson for us is that when we leave a life of sin, don't look back on it. Keep looking forward so that we don't fall back into sin again. Now, some might be asking, why a pillar of salt? We think of salt as a spice, but back then salt was first a preservative. By looking back, Lot's wife seemed to be wanting to preserve something of her past. That pillar would go on to be a reminder for others not to hang on to the desires of a sinful past life, but instead keep moving forward and coming closer to God. One more weird thing in this story. Lot and his daughters make their home in a cave in the mountains. Nobody else around. These daughters realize that there aren't any men around for them to marry or have children. A woman without children is frowned upon in that society, which we learned from Sarah. So, these girls get the idea of getting their father drunk 2 times so that they can have sex with him and get pregnant. Now remember that it wasn't bad yet to marry a blood relative, but it was never okay if it was their own father. Isn't it ironic that these young ladies made the same type of mistake that their great Aunt Sarah made? As crazy as it sounds, God still took care of them. The 2 boys that Lot's daughters gave birth to became men known as the father of the Moabites and the father of the Ammonites. Now that everyone is uncomfortable and squirmy, we need to put some purpose to this. Now, a few hundred years after this event, Moses would present the people with a law not allowing marriage among relatives. This was an example of why the law was necessary. The story about Sodom and Gomorrah would be discussed in the New Testament. Jesus said in the Gospel of John that the coming judgment will be worse than it was for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Totally wiped out is pretty bad. What's worse? What Jesus meant was that Sodom and Gomorrah didn't turn away from God because they never knew God. And once Jesus was on the scene, the people didn't have the excuse anymore. So sinful living, even though they knew better, would be judged more harshly. You knew better, but you still chose to live in sin, is what he's saying. It is often said that Jesus won't return until the world is as sinful as Sodom and Gomorrah were. Well, we are pretty close. So close that all it would take for there to be a news story. God's judgment is coming at any moment. Which side of that judgment do you want to be on? What about loved ones? Have you made them aware? You know, it's still their choice, not yours, but do they grasp the brevity of the situation? You know what's worse than being wiped out? Being left alive, eternally separated from God. Having the full knowledge and understanding of the why, but stuck in hell forever. Sin may seem small, but it grows, and you find yourself doing and saying things that you would not have thought yourself capable of. Our world is so wrapped up in promoting sinful living that all of us are saying, I couldn't have imagined this kind of stuff in my lifetime. But here we are, living with it. Us Christians often look at the Israelites and how they came close to God, fell into sin, experienced God's judgment. They came close to God again, repeating it over and over. And we're thinking, man, they just don't learn. But here we are, with our society, government, even churches declaring sin is okay. But somehow think that there won't be judgment. God judges. People portray God as all-loving, but it is not a biblical model of God's love. God can't be loving if he doesn't judge. People are always screaming for justice. Let me ask a question. Please respond. Do you think that someone that breaks the law should be held accountable? Have you ever broken one of God's laws? Then shouldn't you be held accountable? The only chance we have of not suffering a fate worse than Sodom is to accept the gift of redemption from Jesus. Only then will our sins be forgiven. Only then can we escape God's judgment. We each need a clean heart, a right spirit, so that we are not cast away from God's presence.